It is good to see you. Good to have those of you that are visiting with us. Appreciate you being in our class. This study in Samuel seems to just go on. And I don't know about you, but I personally am enjoying this study and intend to just keep going with 2 Samuel. Actually, both of these books, we think of them as two separate books, but originally when penned was not two separate books, maybe two separate scrolls, because there was too much information to contain on one scroll, but only one actual book or volume as we might think of it. But we refer to them because it's divided this way into 1 and 2 Samuel. But hopefully tonight we'll see how one just literally continues into the other. But I want to begin kind of backing up about 6 verses where we were ending our class last week, and for everyone's benefit to kind of bring you up to speed as to where we are. As you know, David has been on the run. Saul has been threatening to kill him for much of his life, actually, his adult life. So David has sought refuge among the territory of the Philistines, and they've given him the city of Ziklag, and that's where David had been staying. And unfortunately, because David had sought refuge among the Philistines, when war broke out against the Philistines and the Israelites, David found himself in a very tough situation because he's been telling his Philistine lord that he's been fighting and raiding in the territory of Israel to put up a front to make it look like you can count on me, you don't have to worry about me, you can leave me alone, when actually he was raiding other groups of individuals, not anything to do with the people of Israel. But now that war breaks out, David is called by his Philistine lord to go with him into battle, and David's like, okay, you can count on me. And when he's assembled with his Philistine lord, the other lords of the Philistines saw David, and they said, he ain't going with us. And so they pitched a fit. And so his Philistine lord said, okay, I guess it's best for you to go back home. And David did. David at least acted as though he was a little bit miffed over this. In my personal opinion, David was just playing out the whole ruse that he's been devising for years now, and just continued. And, I would have gone with you, why you're sending me home, but, he played that part very well. But when he got home, and that's where we're picking up now, when David returns back to his family and back to his possessions that he left behind, it happened that when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Bezor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Bezor. Then they found an Egyptian in the field, and brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate, and they let him drink water. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I am a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belonged to Judah, and of the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, can you take me down to this troop? So he said, swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop. When he had brought him down, there they were, spread out all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Then David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives, and nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. David took all the flocks and herds they had driven before those other livestock and said, this is David's spoil. Now, David came to the 200 men who had been so weary that they could not follow David, whom they had also made to stay at the brook Besor. So they went out and met David to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. But David said, my brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered it into our hand, the troop that came against us. For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stayed by the supplies. They shall share alike. So it was. From that day forward he made a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. Now, when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. To those who were in Bethel, those who were in Ramoth of the south, those who were in Jatir, those who were in Arar, those who were in Siphmoth, those who were in Stemoa, those who were in Rakal, those who were in the cities of the Jarmilites, those who were in the cities of the Kenites, those who were in Hormah, those who were in Korashan, those who were in Atak, those who were in Hebron, to all the places where David himself and those who couldn't pronounce these names and his men were accustomed to rove. Aren't you glad you're not Hebrew? At least you don't speak Hebrew. Now, I want to ask you this question. Concerning the 200 that were so weary they could not cross the brook and go with David. They stayed instead and guarded the supplies. I know we have military personnel, former at least, in the class. Can you tell me if there's any benefit in having a supply line for your troops? So is what they do not necessary and essential to the survival of an army or of a troop? It's an amazing. It is interesting that these men are described by God as what kind of men that are complaining that they should be sent home with nothing except their wives and their stuff. Just they don't get any of the spoils of war. They're not going to share with what we've done. How are they described by God? Wicked and worthless. This is an inspired description, by the way. So the wicked and worthless people who are petty-minded, small-minded men, who are wanting to be vindictive, and these men don't deserve to share in what we have. And it's interesting how David responded to them. Who's going to listen to you in this matter? Nobody's going to pay attention to that. That's just ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. And in fact, you could go back to the book of Joshua, and you can see in Joshua and in the book of Numbers, there were two instances where God had actually instructed the people to share with their brethren. You remember when the tribe of Reuben came over and assisted in the settling of the land of Canaan and had fulfilled their commitment that they had made to Moses years earlier. Joshua sent them back home with the spoils of war. And he said, when you get home, you share this with your brethren. Even the ones that had not come across the Jordan to fight with them, they were to share and to share alike. But anyway, I want to go back to verse 6. Now, I just touched on this briefly last week, but it's rather amazing to me when you think about this army of 600 men. And of course, there were women and others, but primarily we think of the 600 men who were David's army. They have assembled themselves with David because they really had nowhere else to go, many of them. A lot of them were outlaws. A lot of them owed taxes. And so they're seeking refuge with David. But they've been serving with David now for years. This is not a new thing for them. David has been their leader and has provided for them, taken care of them. But David made a decision to go to Ziklag and find refuge there. They were content to go to Ziklag with David. They were content to raid those other territories and enjoy the spoils of war all of this time. Until war broke out between Philistia and Israel. And David found himself in this very difficult situation where he's going to have to go and fight with the Philistines. So they abandoned their families for what, about 3 days? And during that period of time, the Amalekites come on a raiding tour and raided Ziklag and took David's wives and the wives of his men, his soldiers and others, and carried them off. And they were kidnapped. None of them, thankfully, were killed, but they were kidnapped. Isn't it amazing how this army that's been serving loyally and faithfully with David suddenly is ready to stone him? Isn't that amazing? You remember when Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem, the city residents were there spreading palm branches along the road. And Jesus was riding on a donkey. And they were saying what out loud as he's entering into the city? Hosanna to the Son of David. Before the week was over, they're going to be crying, crucify him. I mention this to say, anytime anyone assumes the mantle of leadership, I don't care what you're leading, be it a general. Generals have to make tough decisions a lot of times. They know oftentimes when they look at a battle plan that they calculate how many of their men are very likely going to die in that battle. And they know that when they send that order out for that attack to begin, they're going to lose almost instantly so many people. I mean, you imagine those generals on D-Day that were sending those men onto those beaches to storm those beaches. They knew what was going to happen. And many generals have spent sleepless nights knowing that the decision they made affected their troops that way. A lot of times when decisions are made, it's not popular. Particularly as a leader, when you make a decision that affects the group, whatever that group is, be it an army, be it a church, be it a business, or whatever it is, if you're the leader of that group and you make a decision and it has impact on everybody in that group, you've got to have some really broad shoulders, because if you make a decision that everybody likes, let's say, for example, you're going to bring about tax reform. And within just a couple of months, everybody in the country will, hey, we were lied to by the mainstream media again. We were told that we were going to get taxed more heavily, and instead, I got more money on my paycheck because my tax rate went down, and I got more money to spend. Isn't that great? Or maybe you just got hired by one of those companies that's hiring because they've gotten an incentive to hire more people, and you realize the benefits of that. And so you're thinking, what a great thing. And so we see opinion polls rising about this tax thing. The tax bill back in December was in the low 30s, high 30s, low 40s. Now it's over 50% of people that approve. I'm like, give it time, it's going to grow even more in popularity. That's a popular decision, but other decisions are made that are not so popular. I mean, ask President Trump what leadership feels like. And you think about the kind of criticism that he takes on a daily basis. I mean, if people were inclined to stone other people, he would have been stoned a long time ago. They would have just taken him out and stoned him to death. They're trying to stone him now. Verbally, they are stoning him on a daily basis. And you say, why? Well, because he's stupid and he doesn't know what he's doing. He just happened to be a very successful businessman who's now president of the United States, but he doesn't know what he's doing. That's what we're told, and that's what we're supposed to believe, because well, that's what people say about it. And I'm saying this to anyone who would presume to be a leader, be it in a Bible class, be it a deacon, be it an elder, be it a preacher. Ricky, you're in your honeymoon. I'm happy for you. I'm happy for you. Enjoy it while you can. And the honeymoon's over, and people think, hey, I don't know if I'm going to go with him on this or that. I'm just saying that leadership carries with it a heavy burden. And we have to be prepared as leaders to bear that burden, because you're going to be criticized. And there are going to be times when people just want to take you out and kill you. I mean, they just want to stone you. We're talking about David. Now, did David have leadership qualities? Well, when we hear of Jesus, he's reigning on whose throne? Does God think that David had leadership qualities? God chose him to be a leader. Was he a good leader? Well, yes, he was. But even the best of leaders, at times, have troops that want to stone them to death. I'm just saying this because you may be suffering yourself at times for whatever. Maybe you're a manager. Maybe you're suffering even in your role in church because you don't think that things are going your way. That's the burden. One of the things that I learned, you don't mind me saying this, Rebecca, from your daddy, was that, a lot of times you just have to make a decision and stick to your guns. And it's not always easy to do. And there were times I gave him fits. I'm ashamed of myself for the way I would give your daddy fits. I'm like, I don't agree with that, Brother Vines. And I'd tell him, and we'd go back and forth over it, and he just kind of smiled and chuckled. It's okay. And I'm like, you're supposed to get mad at me. He wouldn't get mad at me. He just kind of let it roll off his back, and he just went on about his business, did what he was going to do. I admire that. I think that's an admirable quality. And we need to learn to be able to just smile and say, well, you have a right to your views and your opinion. And of course, I have to say this about him too. If he was wrong and he realized he was wrong, he would admit it. And he would correct it as best he could. And I think that was a great quality that he possessed as well. And it ought to be emulated. But even the best, David, found himself in distress, as the text says here, verse 6. But verse 7, the latter part of verse 6, verse 7, David strengthened himself in the Lord, and that's where we ended our class last week. Now, verse 26 through the end of the chapter, David does something interesting. He takes the spoils of war and he sends them out to the people of Judah, to the various leaders of Judah. And why is he doing that, you suppose? He's buttering them up. But everyone appreciates gifts, and so he's sending gifts to these people. And but while all of this is happening, at the same time this is happening, what we're about to read is also happening. Unbeknownst to David, he was not aware of what we're about to read. They didn't have internet and they didn't have cell phones. He didn't see this. He didn't get a play-by-play. He would get a report later from an Amalekite, of all people, but he didn't see it himself. Now, chapter 31. Any questions or comments about chapter 30? Chapter 31. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. On Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those who were on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his son were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temples of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. What a tragic end to the life of an otherwise great man, a man at least who started his career as a great man. God's chosen. God handpicked Saul to be the first captain over his people. And before we get into the text here, or what we may say about the text, I want to just generally look at the life of Saul and think about where he went wrong and the qualities that we have observed in this class about Saul. What are some of your thoughts when you think about how he took a wrong turn mentally, spiritually, emotionally? What would be some of the things you said contributed to his downfall? Well, jealousy certainly would be at the top of the list, yeah.
Lack of obedience.
His what now?
Lack of obedience to God.
Interesting you said that. I would like to explore that one a bit. In 1 Samuel 15, God had instructed very clearly Saul to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. Leave no one alive. Anytime you go on a military expedition, that's a big deal. I mean, if you're going to lead troops into battle, that's a big deal, particularly hand-to-hand combat. So when you think about what God's instructing Saul to do, he's not asking him to cross the street and give the little old lady on the other side of the street a piece of candy. He's telling him to risk his life and the life of your men to go to the Amalekites and utterly destroy them. That by itself is a big deal. But did Saul do that? Did he go to the Amalekites and fight against them?
Yeah,
he did, didn't he? And so when he came back from defeating the Amalekites, and Samuel met him, the first thing he said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord.
Amen.
And what does Samuel say? What is the meaning of this sound that I'm hearing? I hear these sheep here. What's all this noise and ruckus? And who's this guy? The king of the Amalekites. Who's this? And so after Samuel reminds him that to obey is better than sacrifice because Saul did something else, he exposed another character flaw on this occasion. And that character flaw was, when confronted with a sin, what did he do? The people they wanted to worship God, and so they saved the best of the sheep and oxen to worship God. It's not my fault. I'm just the king. I can't tell these people what to do. I'm just the king. So, they saved the best of the sheep and the ox. Well, who's this guy, the king of the Amalekites, that you're parading before these people? Samuel drew out a sword and hewed him to pieces. My kind of preacher, pale rider. But anyway, he pulled out a sword and just chopped him into pieces. And I'm like, wow, that's rough. That's what God had commanded. That's a hard bit. Some people have even questioned that, whether God would have ever commanded us. That's what God commanded him to do. But Saul, you see, is reminding us, and there's so many people that are like Saul. They do a lot of what God says, and they conclude, I've obeyed the voice of the Lord. I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I'm willing to repent of my sins. I'm willing to confess that Jesus is the Son of God, but I ain't going to be baptized because baptism ain't got nothing to do with salvation. Well, how can we argue that I'm obedient to God when Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved? I ain't going to do that because I don't see any reason for it. But if the Lord tells us to do that, how can we argue that I'm obedient when, but I've believed, I'm a believer, and I've repented, and I've confessed, I just don't want to be baptized. Or I don't want to attend church services, or whatever, and you fill in that blank. I mean, people do that kind of thing all the time. So partial obedience is a big problem. But so is passing the buck. When you don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to raise your hand. But who in this room has ever committed a sin? Okay, who in this room has ever made a mistake that was sinful? Maybe you did something in the heat of the moment. Maybe you lost your temper, said a bad word. When you hit your hand. Why did they say bad enough for a preacher to cuss? I'm not tempted to cuss. I might throw something or break something. I usually yell at inanimate objects. I don't know why. But if I'm working on something, the drill slips off the screw and it hits. You ever had the drill hit your hand and cut into your hand? That's painful. I got one the other day, went right into my knuckle. I'm like, ow. I got to buy a new drill. But I'm like, why? I didn't cuss. I didn't cuss. I'm not sure why people say, well, that must make a preacher go. Well, the preacher had to be willing to cuss before he can cuss, but I don't cuss. But I've never been in a habit. But it's enough to make me throw it, or break something, or yell at it. Why did you do that? But if you ever do anything, and someone confronts you with it, as Samuel did, confront him with a sin, what is your knee-jerk response?
It wasn't me.
It wasn't me. You misunderstood. We always try to find a way around, it wasn't me. I did not have sexual relation with that. We all remember that from the 90s, don't we? Wagging that finger at the camera. But when you're confronted, what's the tendency? Now, on the other hand, David, Nathan come to him. What had David done? Well, first of all, he committed adultery. Then he murdered the husband of the woman he committed adultery with to cover it up. Nathan comes to him and tells him this story. David's furious. Whoever did that is going to have to pay fourfold. You're the one I'm talking about.
That's right.
And when Nathan said that to David, what did David instantly say? I've sinned. And then he begins writing these beautiful penitential psalms. There's a number of psalms that David wrote on that occasion. The 51st, of course, more prominent one that comes to mind. I'm just a horrible person. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. I'm just terrible. I'm awful. And I'm just a sinful person. But he didn't defend himself. He didn't say, well, I had a right to. She shouldn't have been out there run naked like that. He didn't try to make any excuses. He just said, what I did was wrong. And I think when you think about that, because we've pointed this out many times in our class, that with Saul and David, both of them were sinners. Both of them made mistakes. Both of them were deeply flawed on many levels. But it's the character of these individuals that makes all the difference in the world. When Saul is confronted, I did what God told me to do. He didn't. He partly did, but not. Partial obedience is absolute disobedience, by the way. You say I partially did, then you didn't obey. To obey is to obey, period. But he didn't. He only partially obeyed. When Saul was confronted, it wasn't my fault, the people saved the best of the sheep and the oxen. As Americans, we're skilled at finding excuses for our faults and for our sins. And if all else fails, I was born this way. Genetics made me like this. I can't help it. It's not my fault. You have beautiful ears. Why are you pointing to your ears? Speaking of your daddy, I saw a hand. Yes, Ricky.
I was going to say that it's kind of ironic here that he actually, in a sense, brings it back to blaming God, just like Adam did in the first place when he's talking about Eve. This woman that you gave me, it's your fault. And Saul is saying, well, we did this so we can worship. So we done it for the people. It's all God oriented, and which is, like you're saying, it's just totally against what we need to be doing. But still trying to justify himself some kind of way, somehow that he's done the right thing, but clearly he had not.
To obey is better than sacrifice. And that's what he needed to hear. God wants you to do what he says. So you can't substitute worship for obedience. Yes?
Yes, I guess as we all know now, having all this history, right, that Herod is
That's right. Well, notice who in chapter 30, who was it that raided Ziklag? It was Amalekites. And so who's David having to go fight against? Amalekites. If Saul had done his job, there wouldn't be a problem with the Amalekites. And we're not through with the Amalekites. They're going to come up again in the next book. But this is awful the way Saul died. He committed suicide, but he was, I believe he was no doubt mortally wounded, or at least he was wounded to the point he couldn't get himself off the battlefield, and he knew he could not escape, and he was fearful. He knew that the Philistines will certainly catch up with me, and they're going to abuse me, which meant they were going to torture him, and he would just rather just end my suffering, just die. So he committed suicide. There are not that many suicides recorded in Scripture. But it's almost like when you think about his suicide, you think of others like Judas Iscariot. You think of individuals whose lives were just ruined. Ahithophel, I believe, also would later commit suicide, which doesn't seem to be justified in my mind on any level, which there's never a justification for it. But I'm just saying that you can understand someone in this extreme situation, fearful of what's about to happen to him, having lost all good judgment anyway. But what a pitiful, tragic end to the life of the first king in Israel. Chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, we're just continuing where we left off. It came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had stayed 2 days in Ziklag, on the third day, behold, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So it was when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, "Where have you come from?" So he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did the matter go? Please tell me." And he answered, "The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also." Now, this is going to come up later in the chapter, but I just want you to put yourself in David's sandals for a moment. And this individual just popped up and he's telling you this. It's just kind of rolling off his mouth. Just blurts it out. Have you ever had to tell someone, have you ever had to break the news to someone that a loved one, a dear loved one, has passed away? It's not easy to do. It's not a pleasant job. And so here's this man, and he's telling David, but you already know, probably perceptive enough to know that the average person, not knowing David any better than they do, thinks, no doubt, I'm giving David some good news. After all, he's in Ziklag, a territory of the Philistines. He's not even in his own home state. And the reason he's not there is because Saul's been chasing him, trying to kill him. Now that Saul's dead, he's going to be really happy to hear that. No doubt, he's excited. He wants to share this news. So David said to him, rather the latter part of verse 4, he answered, "The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen dead, and Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also." And David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead?" Notice again, he doesn't want to believe it. I want you got to do something to confirm what you're telling me is true. I don't want to. You ever had somebody tell you something, I can't believe it. You prove it to me. It's not like he's just calling an outright liar, just like you're instantly emotionally caught off guard. What do you mean? How do you know this to be true?
You really love Jonathan.
Oh, very much. And the young man told him and said, "As I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa," now you already know he's lying. This is a battle scene. You don't just by chance show up on a battle scene. But anyway, nobody's that stupid. But anyway, as I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear, just out fishing, I guess. He and Opie had just come back from fishing, leaning on his spear, and indeed the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him, because I just happened to be there. Now when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, "Here I am." And he said to me, "Who are you?" So I answered him, "I am an Amalekite." He said to me again, please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me. So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. Was any of that true?
No.
How did Saul die?
He
Fell on his own sword.
Yeah.
And so who is this dude? Well, he just told you who he was. He's an Amalekite. Now, David has just come back from killing a bunch of Amalekites. Saul lost the throne because he did not utterly destroy the Amalekites. And so this Amalekite is now taking credit for killing it. And no doubt he thinks he's telling David what David wants to hear. David took hold of his own clothes, tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who told him, where are you from? And he answered, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. David said to him, how was it you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? David called one of the young men and said, go near and execute him. And he struck him so that he died. So David said to him, your blood is on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. He was in for a rude awakening. Didn't get the reaction he thought he would get. And it's interesting because in doing this, in reacting this way, David was also sending out a very clear message to anyone who would see it. I'm not responsible for Saul's death. I didn't do this. It's not me. It's not on me. But then we have this funeral lament. David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. That's the name of the song of the bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher. We do not have the book of Jasher. Apparently, it was a book that was heavily leaned upon in compiling the material we're now studying from 1st and 2nd Samuel. Those probably were notes that were used from time to time, but it's a book that we don't have. Was it inspired? I do not know. But it was a book that's mentioned here in Inspiration. There are other books we know that are mentioned in the Bible which we do not have copies of. We simply are assured that we have what God would have us to have. Now listen to this song. The beauty of Israel is slain in your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Goth. Proclaim it not in the streets of Askelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. By the way, have you been to Mount Gilboa?
I saw it from another mountain in the distance, and I knew it went right to it.
Was it green and plush, and did it look like a beautiful place to live?
Well, I couldn't tell that far away.
No, it's too far off.
Yeah. Across the valley of the Rica, where we were.
I've been told even to this day it's just like a lunar rock,
Right.
a lunar mountain. It's just desolate. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothe you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. You probably have heard portions of this text used in funerals. I know I have. I've even used portions like this at different times in funerals. What strikes you about this? When you think about who's singing this song, what's the first thing that catches your attention?
It's a tribute to Saul, the man that was trying to kill him.
Okay. This is strong and powerful, isn't it? So was David, finally he got what he deserved. Nothing like that. He was brokenhearted that Saul was dead, but Jonathan was dead. Of course, Jonathan, and it's hard for us to hear his love surpassed the love of women in today's culture, because we interpret that and say, ooh, what kind of relationship was that? Well, it wasn't that, clearly. But David and Jonathan's souls were knit together. That's how the King James translates it. They were very close. They were very good friends. Something else strikes me about this lament, and that is how David is reminding us, and we would know that anyway, but is reminding us that Jonathan was there alongside his father when they died in battle. Now, that speaks a great deal about Jonathan. Jonathan and David were very much kindred spirits. Neither one of them obviously were vindictive. They were great warriors and they were mighty fighters, but they were not vindictive individuals. And here he is fighting alongside his father. Why does that matter?
Because he didn't leave his father.
He did what?
He didn't leave his father.
He did not forsake his father, but why should he have?
Because his father was trying to kill David, whom he didn't like.
That. Who else did he try to kill? He tried to kill Jonathan. He tried to kill him once. And he didn't believe Jonathan. Never did take his counsel about David. But it didn't matter. Jonathan stuck with his father even to the point of death. Show loyalty. So did David show loyalty. David would have been right beside him too, had he not been having to run for his life because Saul was determined to kill him. But David would have been right there with Jonathan, fighting to the last Philistine if he had to, because that was their nature. That's who they were. They were certainly team players, even though they didn't always see eye to eye, obviously. But I think this speaks volumes of David and of Jonathan. And so again, both these men loved one another very much. And this Amalekite, I want you to think about the irony here. God told Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites. He did not utterly do what God told him to do. And so now that he's dead, it was an Amalekite that took his crown and took his bracelet. And it's Amalekite that goes to David and claimed to have killed him. That was a lie. But nevertheless, he took his crown and his bracelet. Isn't that a great irony? That it was an Amalekite that's doing this to Saul, even when he's dead. I don't know about you, but I almost see something providential in that. How things have when you read the Bible that way, it's amazing. We talk about, some of the works of Shakespeare and some of his, masterpieces that he's written. He can't hold a candle to reality as it's recorded by God in Scripture. And when you think about not just this case, but like the story of Esther, for example, and the feud between Haman and Mordecai, and what eventually happened, to these gallows that were erected, and who actually wound up hanging on those gallows, and why he was hanging on those gallows. It reminds us of what Solomon said: whoever digs a pit, you're going to fall into it. See? You're going to dig it. It's kind of like, hey, let's start a prosecutor, an investigation to look into. I didn't say that. Chapter 2, verse 1. It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household, so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh-Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. Also will repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. Now therefore, let your hand be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. Why was it significant that the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead were the ones burying Saul? What's significant about that? Militarily speaking, what was the first thing Saul ever did? He came to the defense of the people of Jabesh Gilead. Remember, they were told, I believe it was Moab and Ammon had come up against them, and they said, you got 3 days to decide. We're going to poke your eye out, or we're going to come kill you. So they sent out word, and Saul heard about it, and Saul took some oxen and chopped them in pieces and sent them out to all the elders of Israel and said, I'm going to do you the same way, or do your herds the same way if you don't come help me. So he rallied the troops. He did a Twitter thing. That was the old-fashioned Twitter thing. You send body parts to the people of Israel. And they all heard it. And, of course, they got on the fake news that night, and they talked about what a horrible man this is. Look how terrible he's done. But anyway, he was able to rally the troops. You know what I'm saying is true, right? That was the first form of tweeting. But anyway, he got them all together, and they went and fought, and they delivered the men of Jabesh Gilead. And now that he's dead, the men of Jabesh Gilead knew how his body had been abused, and they took it, that was fastened on the wall, took it down, and they burned it. Why do you suppose they burned his body? They don't typically do that in Israel. Why do you suppose they would have burned his body? What's that? I don't think it was the evidence. I think it was the decomposition. It probably was to the point that it couldn't be embalmed or in any way could not be preserved. So they did the burning, but they took the bones that were left and buried the bones. And so they were not desecrating the body by burning it. They were not showing disrespect. It was quite the opposite. They were doing what they could to be as respectful under the circumstances. So indeed, the men of Jabesh Gilead deserve praise on this occasion.
Well, at that time on the battlefield, they were given time to get their dead up like that.
Yes.
Well, they could do
That's right. But not in this case. They took Saul and cut his head off and his arms. And anyways, it's horrible. Of course, David did the same thing to Goliath, remember?
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
You were.
Yeah, I really was. And do you think Saul didn't like David because he was favored by God, and that's a threat to Saul?
Yes, that and other things.
That's what I was thinking, maybe.
He didn't care for David at all.
No, and Jonathan and David were just like brothers.
Yeah. Father and son saw him very differently, didn't they?
David was really just showing respect to Saul as far as the burial and stuff.
That would be kind of like the way we take care of a flag, once it gets to
You burn it.
a bad deal, we don't just throw it away, we actually burn it. And
But there's a ceremony with that.
Yeah.
If you want to ever see that, the VFW will do that sometimes over at the Ag Center in Carroll, and they'll show you, demonstrate the proper way to dispose of a flag. I mentioned that to somebody before, they're like, they burned the flag? I'm like, well, they're not burning the flag like, I almost said it out loud, like a progressive might do, I almost said Democrat out loud, didn't I? But they're not burning the flag that way. They're actually burning it in a very respectful way. What's wrong with you? I don't have any. $813, please, in your songbooks. Don't forget the area-wide singing at Cedartown this Friday. The refreshments will be served following the singing. Don't forget the Yes Weekend coming up this weekend. Anything we need to mention in connection with that, Scott? I mean,
If you have not paid your hotel fees, then I need that as
Okay, 1 p.m. here. If you still have a balance on your room, you can do that now or as quickly as you can. All right. Money for the Master will be next Monday, the 26th at 6 o'clock. We'll be having a potluck meal together before we begin our work. Then the Widowhood Luncheon is mentioned again here on the 28th. We're going to be having a monthly luncheon, the fourth Wednesday of each month. For those who have lost their spouses, this will be a time of fellowship, encouragement, and possibly to hear a message from guest speakers. Lunch will be provided. Please sign the list on the table in the foyer. And then there's a ladies' night out announcement on March the 8th. Will now be at the Seabreeze in Douglasville, not Logan's, as previously announced. Logan's, as you know, unfortunately has gone out of business. And by the way, there are plates, bowls, glasses, other things that have been contributed to us from Logan's. And it's my understanding that if you would like to go look at those, they're in the fellowship hall on the far end. If you need to use, they've got some really nice serving bowls, other things you might could use. Knock yourself out. There's some nice coffee cups we could certainly use here at the church building, but if you like coffee cups at home, sure could use those too. But just go through that stuff and see what you might be able to use, and I'm sure you'll be able to benefit from that. But appreciate Amy and others who brought that to us from that closing. But again, the ladies' night out will be at Seabreeze in Douglasville. I want to remind you about that. On March the 18th, we're going to be having our gospel meeting, and it's going to be essentially a GSOP meeting. Brother David Decker will be kicking off that meeting, and we're going to be using some of our own former students and one other student from the George School of Preaching to do the preaching throughout the week. We're very excited about this development, and I wanted to make you aware of that now. March the 18th, so it's coming up rather quickly, so please be making plans and making invitations to be a part of our gospel meeting in March. Any other announcements we need to make at this time? We're mentioning tonight about King Saul, many of the character flaws that led to his downfall. One of them, as Brother Kenneth pointed out to us, was that he was not simply an obedient individual, but he didn't always see it that way. He claimed at times to be obedient when in fact he was disobedient. And I think we've all perhaps been in that same boat with him before. We convince ourselves that we're okay, we're all right, because we've done most everything we're supposed to do. But God's not asking us to do most everything that he asks us to do. He's asking us to do what he says, period. And we illustrated that in class tonight by those who will say, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe he died on the cross for my sins. I'm willing to repent of my sins. I'm willing to confess him, but don't ask me to be baptized, because I don't think baptism has anything to do with salvation. That's the reasoning of many today, unfortunately. But again, that's only partial obedience. Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. Mark 16, verse 16. There may be some present tonight who need to fully obey the gospel and make things right with God, or maybe you need to respond to the invitation and make needs known, whether it be to return to your first love or ask for the prayers of your brethren. If we can assist you in any way, please make that need known while together we stand and as we sing.